I'm James Brooks, president of SAR, and this is our penultimate lecture in our public lecture series on the anthropology of food. Mary Weismantel is professor of anthropology at Northwestern University. She did her PhD at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in 1986. She has a wide variety of research interests. She's written on topics ranging from food to adoption, from contemporary popular culture to ancient ceramics. Two threads connect her work: her long-term interest in the ancient Americas and a methodological and theoretical interest in developing interdisciplinary approaches to the study of the past that incorporate archaeological interest in political economy and ethnographers' holistic sensibility and humanism of the art historian. Right, so please join me in welcoming Professor Mary Weismantel.
Well, I want to thank James so much for that introduction and for the chance to be here. I will take any chance to come back to New Mexico, which I love more than anywhere else on earth. And I also just think the SAR is such a wonderful institution, and so I'm always glad to be here for that reason too. And for challenging me to finally sort of put my money where my mouth is. I've been walking around for a while saying I had a talk to give about deer, but this is the first time I've actually tried to do it. So, so what I want to do tonight is to present you with a puzzle from ancient Peru, a puzzle concerning, just put this away, a puzzle concerning this small ceramic sculpture, a pot in the shape of a deer that is more than 1,000 years old. So let me talk a little bit about the ancient Moche, the people who made that pot, and then about deer in Moche art and why I think they're kind of a puzzle. And then for some answers, I want to look cross-culturally at what we could maybe say about deer hunting. So the ancient Moche. Here's a few basic facts, a few famous sites, and then a little bit about the ceramics. First of all, the Moche were on the north coast of Peru in South America. When the Spanish conquered Peru, as you probably know, they encountered this enormous empire, the Inca Empire. On the north coast, the Inca were technically in charge, but there was a very powerful and wealthy kingdom called Chimu, and the Chimu dynasty was still very powerful, so it was kind of a little bit more of a détente between the Inca and the Chimu than a genuine conquest. And if we go back in time before the Chimu, we arrive at the Moche from the first millennium. So there's a lot of cultural continuity between Moche and Chimu. But on the other hand, you know, the Moche are kind of back there in time. So we don't have very much documentary evidence. We're very dependent on the archaeology. Now, there's some things that we can say are that the north coast of Peru is a very arid, desert coastal landscape. It's kind of like New Mexico with an ocean, if you can imagine that. And it does have river valleys, and so the source of wealth and the foundation of empire on the north coast was systems of irrigation. And the Moche especially expanded irrigation enormously. So they put huge areas of land under irrigation, much more than actually is farmed today. If we look at environment and diet in the Moche area, what we see is that they're utilizing a variety of different ecosystems. On the one hand, the Pacific coastline of Peru is enormously wealthy in fish and shellfish. So about half of their diet is coming directly from the ocean. However, they also have these large areas of domesticated landscapes, fields producing corn and other vegetables, and then corrals full of domesticated animals, llamas primarily. And they're getting kind of most of the other half of their food from those sources. The wild desert landscapes, they are doing a little bit of hunting and gathering, but it's a really minor source of food. So these are not hunting people. These are settled agriculturalists. They are fishermen, but they're really not doing very much hunting, including very much deer hunting. Now, let's just take a look at a couple of the famous sites. The most famous and the oldest, the site that's been known the longest is the site of Moche itself. The Spanish actually were very aware of this site. The Huaca del Sol is one of the largest pyramids in the Americas, and it's only half the size it used to be because the Spanish became aware there was gold inside it and diverted a river in order to be able to mine more effectively from it. However, the Huaca de la Luna, another pyramid there, has been it's been a place where there's been ongoing archaeological excavation for decades now, and continuing amazing finds. More recently, in the 1990s, another site, Sipan, got a lot of attention. Some of you may know this if you subscribe to National Geographic, because there were fabulous burials that had not been looted, which is very unusual, that produced great quantities of gold. And we can just briefly visit here Tomb 1, one of the most famous of those excavations. And you can kind of see here some of the gold and silver and turquoise starting to come up out of the ground. Here's a reconstruction, and you can see that there's lots of different bodies here, men, women, old people, children, llamas, dogs, all kinds of stuff in this tomb. But the attention really focused on this central tomb because the finds were so spectacular. The guy who was buried in Tomb 1 was just covered in jewelry, just layer upon layer upon layer of gold and silver and feathers and semi-precious stones. It's just kind of amazing. Some of the more remarkable finds are this necklace of gold and silver peanuts, and then we could just mention the gold and turquoise deer earrings. This guy had so much jewelry, it was like he couldn't decide which outfit to wear, so they buried him in all of them. So he, on top of his ears were 3 different sets of earrings, for example. And this is just a little aside. I have a couple of asides I couldn't resist. You may have noticed walking around in Albuquerque, it's become kind of a fad now to have these big stretch lobe earrings. It kind of goes with the tattoos and the piercings. This is exactly the way that elite men in the ancient Americas wore their earrings. They would wear these enormous earrings that stretched their earlobes out. So the Spanish referred to them as the orejones, the big ears. So let's talk now about the ceramics. It's touchy to say this in the Southwest, but Moche ceramics are widely believed to be one of the finest ceramic traditions of the ancient Americas, along with the ceramics of the Southwest and the Maya, but they really are quite beautiful. I just have to always put this slide in because the take-home message from this talk is not, I want to go onto eBay and buy a Moche pot. You certainly can. There's lots of them for sale. They are all the products of illegal looting. And of course, this is devastating for archaeology. So Moche, the Moche area, like the Southwest, you know, it's been subject to looting systematically since the colonial period. And today, there's just a range of looting from, you know, a couple of teenagers with a bottle of booze and some shovels to really professional criminal organizations. So archaeological sites look kind of like craters of the moon. So almost the point of that is that almost all the ceramics I'm going to show you, we don't have much archaeological context for. They are the product of this kind of looting. They show up in private collections and then move into museums. So the most famous Moche pots are the portraits of male leaders and the fine line paintings of battles. And these are great pots. They're wonderful. This has led to an emphasis on military conquest and on power and domination. So the literature on Moche really emphasizes those themes. And those themes, I think, are certainly there in Moche art. But it was interesting for me, I know this is me really being a girl, but it was interesting to me to walk into storerooms like at the Field Museum in Chicago, where I started doing research, which has an enormous collection of Moche ceramics, and you walk in and you're like, well, where are the ones I saw in the pictures? Because what you see are not rulers or battles. What you see are hundreds and hundreds of effigies of plants and animals. There's lots of birds, there's lots of manioc roots, there's lots of all kinds of stuff like that, and really not as much of the kinds of things that we archaeologists and art historians have written about. So one of the challenges that I set myself was, how about if I start talking most about the stuff that the Moche represented the most, instead of the stuff that's most interesting to us? And I think it's hard. It's hard to know what to say about a picture of an animal. With a person, we kind of have more of a story to tell. So we have all kinds of beautiful ceramics like the frog or toad, the ducks, the birds are really gorgeous, the felines, and there's lots of deer, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight. So deer in Moche art. I'm going to talk about just the deer in general, and then I'm going to raise this puzzle for you. So, you know, there's earrings that we saw. There recently, Walter Alva here is pointing to a mural of a deer hunting scene. I'm sorry I don't have a better picture of it. And we can see this Chimu silver vessel of a deer. But most of the deer that we know are ceramic vessels in the form of deer. They're deer effigy pots. These ones are from the Art Institute in Chicago, and I have to just point out that this is something museums love to do. They pair these together as though this was a male-female pair. So, you know, you've got kind of the demure little one with the gown and her hands folded, and then the kind of more masculine guy who's gesturing, you know, except that one thing that I've learned about after reading about the biology of deer and the definition of deer online is if it has antlers, it's a male. So we are seeing these as this girl-boy pair. That's not actually what the Moche were doing with these. At any rate, you have deer painted like this around this big bowl, for example. Here's an image that's really interesting. It's a deer, and he is preparing coca or maybe a hallucinogen, probably some kind of drug or medicine in a mortar and pestle. Now, here's my conundrum. Here's my puzzle. Some Moche deer are very naturalistic, right, which is one of the hallmarks of Moche art, right? They really look like the real deal, like you might see them in nature. Some Moche deer are very fantastic. Like this is one of my favorites, very typical of South American art in general, where you have one image that combines several different species. So if you look at this pot, which is just so gorgeous, I think. The body is a snake, but the head is a deer. And then there's even more going on because the deer has fangs like a feline, right? Like a cougar or a jaguar. And then the pelt of the body is also, that's the pelage or the markings of the jaguar. So you've got 3 different species in this one pot. So very fantastic, right? Now, typically, the naturalistic or the more realistic scenes, what you see are deer being hunted. So these are a little bit hard to make out, but you can see the one at the top. There's a hunter, he's holding a spear, and then you've got the deer, and then the painted image, the deer has the spear sticking out of his back and the tongue hanging out, which I'm told by people who hunt that when you kill a deer, they have a gap in their teeth, and then the big tongue falls out as it's dying. So that's the typical scene in the realistic ones. But in the fantastic mode, the way that deers typically appear are dressed as warriors or hunters. So you may not be able to see this one very well, but in this one, this is the characteristic portrayal of a very elite aristocratic male who is dressed either for hunting or for warfare. And he's carrying his mace, he's got his face paint on, right? So he's ready to go to war and to kill. And here, this one, I can't really talk about the whole variety of images of deer and lima beans. The lima beans is a whole topic, but here you have deer and lima beans dressed as warriors doing battle with one another. Here's my conundrum. In Moche art, deer appear both as the hunter and the hunted. And if you think about it, what do we know about deer? In real life, people kill deer. Right? And deer don't kill anyone, right? They're herbivores. But in Moche art, people kill deer, but then deer are killers too. So it's like they've invented something that you would seem that everyday life would tell them is not the case. So that's my mystery. And one way that I tried to solve that was to look at other animals in Moche art. The animal that's the most like the deer would be the llama, right? They're big, they're herbivores, they're mammals. They do appear in Moche art, but only very naturalistically and kind of humble, They've got their harness on, they're carrying wood, right? That's the way they appear. The llama in the Moche mind does not have a secret life as a powerful warrior or shaman, right? They're always just the way they are in real life. Now, other wild animals aren't like that. Like the fox or the owl, they appear both in their natural form, like you see the owl here, and as warriors or shamans. So they're like the deer, they do both things, but that kind of makes more sense because these are animals that are predators, right? They're not herbivores like the deer. So this seems kind of like an an enigma to me. Now, in order to solve this puzzle, there just aren't that many clues from the ancient past. So we can do this thing that we call ethnographic analogy. We can ask the question, okay, well, what is deer hunting anyway? Okay, what is deer hunting? And I broke this down to 2 questions. I know this sounds kind of dumb, but this is what anthropology lets you do, is ask really basic questions. What is a deer, and what is hunting? And so, what is a deer? We could say, first of all, deer are wild animals. And here's a very rare photo. Deer on the North Coast are very endangered now. But here's a little nature preserve, and here is a deer in the Bosque Seco, in the wild zone on the North Coast. And in a lot of ways, for us symbolically, they're like the essence of the wild. For instance, if you ever saw Princess Mononoke, the movie by the great Japanese filmmaker Miyazaki, the great forest spirit itself, when the spirit of the forest appears, during the day it takes the form of this kind of giant, fantastic deer, right? So deer just kind of symbolize wilderness to us. Or do they? Are they really part of the wild? This is an illustration from the book The Yearling, if any of you have ever read that, where a child tames a deer. In a lot of ways, deer seem like they're both wild and not. They kind of mark the boundary of the wild. The classic case of this, of course, is the reindeer. Reindeer can both be hunted as wild animals, but they also can be herded like cattle. So they're right there at that boundary between wild and tame. So this is, and actually I read some stuff about the biology of deer, and in a lot of ways they resemble other domesticated animals more than they resemble other wild animals. And some archaeologists suggest that maybe deer were in the process of being domesticated in the Americas, but just on a really slow trajectory. So this provides us kind of a clue to the ancient Moche conundrum, because I think in Moche art also, deer mark the boundary of the wild. They're not always like those llamas, but neither do they appear as wild as, say, a jaguar. So that's one little clue for us. Now, we could say that about deer, that deer are animals that humans have hunted for millennia. These are some of the oldest paintings that have ever been found in Peru, and they show deer being hunted. So one way we could look at that is to say that kind of like dogs and humans, deer and humans have co-evolved. We have a long relationship of, like other hunter-prey species, a kind of interdependent relationship. And if you think about that spatially, we tend to think, oh, we live in the cultivated space, deer live in the wild spaces. But if you look at specific places and times, what you tend to see instead is that deer and us, deer don't live in the house with us like dogs do, but we inhabit kind of interdependent spaces. In the US today, certainly, most deer herds are highly managed. I was talking about this example right before the talk, where I used to live in the north suburbs of Chicago. It's one of those suburban areas where the deer population is really huge. And of course, people protest if you shoot them. So what they've done there is that they have this birth control project. So they capture the females and they give them birth control. So the ones with the tags in their ears are on birth control. But as you can see from the untagged one and the babies, there's always these invaders from other areas coming in. But these are very highly managed herds. And that might seem like a kind of, that's us today, the suburbs, whatever. But if we look at other examples around the world and in history, like, for example, British stag hunting, you might think, oh, here's these highly controlled British aristos. They finally get out in the country and get to be a little wild, right? Their excursion into the wilderness. Except actually, if you know anything about the history of hunting in Europe, you know that that's not at all the way this actually worked. As populations in Europe grew, wild spaces became enclosed, and they were set aside as precincts for aristocrats to hunt. And so it's a very controlled population and area, and the right to hunt is very circumscribed. So poaching meant a non-aristocrat who kills a deer, which was punishable by death, right? So there's a very, very managed kind of space and animal. So that could lead us to ask, okay, what's hunting? And here I've done a little excursion into famous writers about hunting. The most famous writer probably is the Spanish author Ortega y Gassett, a philosopher, who points out that not all killing of animals is hunting, right? If you take a gun and go to the zoo and start shooting all the animals in the pens, you're not hunting, you're just slaughtering things, right? And he has a lot of really smart things to say about the way that hunting, there has to be a degree of feeling like there's a contest, but not too much contest. His most famous quote is, "We do not hunt in order to kill, we kill in order to have hunted." And I've spent a lot of time now looking at hunting websites, and this gets quoted a lot, but he's rarely cited. Another famous writer about hunting is Ernest Hemingway, and if you know his writing about bullfighting or about sport fishing, he's got a whole thing going on there about sport killing, that modern men have made weak by civilization, and it's out there when they kill animals that they reclaim their true masculine natures. Very influential. And so writers on hunting tend to have two themes they hit over and over again. One is that hunting is natural. We're carnivores, we hunt, right? It's our animal nature. The other one is it's unchanging. We've always hunted, right? The anthropologists are a little bit skeptical about this. Gary Marvin, for example, I think one of the best anthropologists writing about modern hunting, says, you know, hunting is really cultural. Hunters say that stuff, but how and why we hunt is not like other animals. We're not hunting in the same way or for the same reasons. And also that hunting is really culturally and historically specific. This is the kind of thing cultural anthropologists say all the time. But the way that we hunt now is not like the way we hunted in the past. And the way that one culture hunts is not like the way other cultures hunt. So there isn't a kind of universality or an unchangingness to hunting. Now, what anthropologist me got out of all that is that deer hunting differs from culture to culture. Right? We can just say that. And that means that when we see images of Moche deer hunting, we can really look at those. Like we can just go, oh, they hunt deer just like we do and just like everybody does. We could say, oh, now how are they hunting? What are they thinking about hunting? And it's really going to tell us something about Moche culture. But I think that it also suggests that we can look at other cultures and get some clues, to ask some questions or get some answers about what the Moche are doing. So let's look at some other cultures. And this is a little vulgar. So if we look at EuroAmerican hunting, what we see is images like this. I have to tell you, there are at least hundreds and probably thousands of photographs like this on the web today. Today, when you kill a deer, you have your picture taken like this. I mean, that just seems to be across the board. This particular guy is actually a little bit unusual. He's a local rural guy. He has a blog about his hunting, which he does with his dad, and he always describes himself as hunting in his backyard. I'm not sure how big his backyard is, but that's really something that Marvin points out is that's really quite unusual. There's been a huge change demographically in deer hunting in the U.S. just in the last couple of decades. Old hunting was rural, mostly low-income men. And this is kind of the image of deer hunting I think we often have in our minds, right? That's a family and a community tradition. So there's a lot of stuff about men taking their sons out to hunt, or older brothers and younger brothers. And it was kind of a local thing, right? Maybe not absolutely in your backyard, but, you know, kind of regionally local. The new hunters are very different. Those guys, the older hunters, they complain that their kids don't want to hunt. Right? The sons and grandsons of those hunters just aren't doing it. The people who are hunting now are wealthy urbanites. They're first-time hunters, and they go to commercial venues. A lot of what you find online about hunting now are websites maintained by people who want to sell you a hunt, and they describe it in glowing terms, and they show all those photographs in order to kind of guarantee that you too will have this successful outcome, and you'll go home with your photograph of yourself with your deer. So it's very much really part of the tourism industry. And this is a really recent and very widespread and dramatic change in hunting. Now, when I was thinking about this, it gave me another clue to the ancient Moche, because if you remember, we were going, well, how come they believe things that don't seem to be sort of objectively true? Like, what's wrong with them? Well, you know, this is kind of typical of cultures in general. So if we think about these really new hunters, you know, from the outside you might say, well, in real life, These hunters are paying a commercial entrepreneur to enter a very controlled environment for a carefully managed event, right? I mean, and I'm not saying that to make fun of canned hunts or whatever, but that's pretty much what's going on. In their imaginations, though, what's happening is they're escaping the modern world into nature, and they're going to have this amazing encounter with a wild animal and with their own savage self. And if you read, you know, there's been some recent writing about hunting, and it's very moving. I mean, this actually is the thing on the right. That is what people are experiencing. Right? The thing on the left is also true, but I'm not saying that the thing on the right is just people having crazy ideas. This is genuinely what they're experiencing, right? So here, just like with the ancient Moche, objectively we could say deer don't kill people, but here's the Moche representing them in that way. Here too we see this really complicated relationship between what we might call the objective kind of economic structure of the hunt and then what seems to be going on symbolically. Now, even though there's been these shifts, I would say that there are some real continuities in Euro-American hunting. Hunting is always defined as sport, and here's where Ortega y Gassett has great things to say about what sport is. But it's also seen as conquest, right? It's very much about dominating nature. You go out there, you know, and you're going to show that deer who's boss, right? That's very much in the meaning of the hunt. And the analogies between hunting and warfare are really strong, and they really pervade movies and novels and symbolism about hunting. For instance, the movie The Deer Hunter, there often is this kind of foreshadowing, like what happens on the deer hunt and what happens later on the battleground. So that imagery is very strong. And the other thing that I think is very much part of the Euro-American tradition is when you hunt, like it's supposed to be a contest, but you also want to win. And the way that we like to win is through technological superiority. That's kind of the way that we do it. We feel like that's what sets us apart from the animals. Now, what if we were to look instead at Indigenous American hunting? And this is, again, kind of a vulgar generalization, but what we could say is, so I'm going to look at the very other tradition, which we could find across the Americas, but I think that there are a few things we can say across that whole wide area. And there would be a lot to say using examples from the Southwest, but I'm terrified to do that with this audience, which should be more knowledgeable than me. So my examples are going to come from South America, from Amazonian hunting societies. It's also closer to the ancient Moche. So, and here we can see some examples of, now, modern Amazonian people, when they go hunting, they wear baseball caps and T-shirts. But these guys are sort of dressed to show you how their ancestors hunted. So you've got the blowguns and the bows and arrows. But I think some themes that pervade the indigenous or Native American tradition is the notion that rather than sport, hunting is always very heavily involved in ritual. And I think we all have kind of a vague notion of that, the idea that, you know, you have to ask the spirit of the animal's permission before you kill it. There's certain rituals you have to do. Everything has to be done in a kind of more, I don't know, spiritual way. And if you read or talk to Amazonian people, they will really, really emphasize the role of the shaman and the role of shamanic ritual as part of hunting. And I'll return to some of this in a minute. The other thing that we really see, rather than a conquest ideology, is an ideology of reciprocity between the hunter and the prey. And I'll come back to this theme as well. And also, superiority. Clearly, human hunters, Native American hunters, also want to win over the animal. But rather than technological superiority, there's a really strong tradition instead of emphasizing that the way that you win is not by being different from what you're hunting, but by being as like it as possible, by this really intimate knowledge of your prey. So if we look at this wonderful old woodcut of DeBry, very early colonial depiction of deer hunters, it kind of looks like just two groups of deer, right, on either side of the stream looking at each other. But in fact, if you look at this one group of deer, you might be able to realize that they're not deer at all. These are hunters dressed up as deer, and they've anointed themselves with the scent of deer so that they can get close to the deer and kill them. So if you look, for example, you can maybe see the bow and arrow underneath. And here, if you look, they have these really interesting back feet. There's the deer's back feet, but there's also the people's back feet, right? So we sort of have these themes of ritual, reciprocity, and then intimate knowledge. And so it looks like we've got this huge dichotomy here. Euro-American, sport, conquest, technological superiority. Native American, ritual, reciprocity, intimate knowledge. Except it's really not that simple. You look at this if you look at contemporary people, this dichotomy breaks down really fast. You have images, I mean, the two cultures have influenced one another tremendously. So, like, this is a picture of the back of a pickup truck. It's actually an ad by an artist, I think in Arizona. And so if you want, he'll put this on the back of your pickup truck. And it kind of combines, you know, the rifles and the sort of sort of spirit catcher. I think that either a Native American or a white hunter might be very happy to have this on their truck. And, you know, Native American hunters love technological superiority, at least in some times and places. So Amazonian hunters use shotguns, they use dynamite, they use, you know, vehicles, you know, whatever they can find, available technologies, and often very, very destructively. And then on the other hand, white hunters use myth and ritual. I mean, the ritual and the mythology surrounding hunting among white Americans is very elaborate. Interestingly, they always say that these are Native American, even if they're not. Probably the most prevalent one, excuse me, is the father blooding their child after the first kill. And I read a lot, there's a lot of first kill narratives. That's an old tradition in America among Euro-Americans. And some of them are really interesting. There's many that find it very moving, but there's also ones, like I read one guy who was talking about how he kept trying to miss the deer. He's going, I don't want the testicles hung around my neck. I don't, but this is very much a part of white heritage. So we've got that kind of mixing. And let's talk about the idea of this reciprocity. This is something that might seem to be the most Native American, something that's really not very much part of the European tradition. And it's all about kind of notions of give and take between life and death. So that we kill other creatures and eat them because that's how we get life. So we get any kind of life that we get always comes from death. But then also that means that we ourselves will give our deaths up to produce life in the future, right? So it's my turn today, it'll be yours tomorrow. And this is a very pervasive kind of ideology. And there's many, many examples. I just pulled one out. The Dasana, a tribe in Colombia. Gerardo Reichel Dolmatov wrote a really amazing book in the 1960s about their worldview, and he emphasizes the way that the biggest role of the shaman really is as what he calls a gamekeeper, who conducts and teaches hunting ritual before, during, and after the hunt. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is that otherwise the individual hunter may sicken or die, and it's really moving reading Amazonian ethnography, the degree of kind of anxiety that surrounds hunting, so that in other tribes, for instance, if a group of deer, you think about killing them, and then they move onto a place that used to be someone's home, and you think, maybe it's the spirit of those people. Maybe I better not kill them. So there's a lot of sort of spiritual risk connected. So the shaman gets you through that. But it's not just for you individually, because the conception that you have is that species are sort of like clans. And they have to have a good relationship with one another. So if you, as a hunter, mess up that relationship, then the Dasana would say that each group of animals has a spirit master, and that spirit master will be mad and will not release any more spirits of that animal for any of your clan or any of your village. So there's a lot at risk. And so the notion that the spirit master who might be angered, and of the notion that of that kind of reciprocity. All of these are themes that I think we could use as clues, again, to take back to the ancient Moche. So that reciprocity between killer and killed that seems so puzzling is very much a part of a lot of indigenous traditions. That's one thing. And there even could be something going on. I mean, the Dasana really talk a lot about how each species has its spirit master, or what, it's hard to translate these terms. You could also call it kind of the mother-father of the deer. that controls all of them. So maybe those ordinary deer are ordinary deer that we kill, and some of these images are images of that kind of spirit master who controls the whole species. So those could be some of the kinds of things that are going on in this Moche symbolism. But I have to say about reciprocity that I was surprised to see that this theme also of reciprocity between killer and killed comes up a lot in contemporary hunting. So you have what I started calling deer revenge fantasies. And I'm just going to show you some from the web, but if you go to I don't know, if you like to go to antique stores and flea markets and look at older books and magazines and pictures, you'll also find these. Now here's one, I really like this one a lot. It's a poster by an artist and animal rights activist called Sue Coe, and it's called Lucky Shot, The Animals Dance. And it was commemorating the hunting incident involving Dick Cheney in 2006. So her idea is here you see that the hunters, instead of killing the bird, accidentally shoot each other, and all the animals are celebrating. And you can see here in the middle, our friend the deer is kind of leading the dance. But you could say, okay, but she's an animal rights activist. She hates hunting, right? But it shows up among hunters, too. Like this guy's friends put this up on his website as a joke. So hunters also think it's really funny to imagine themselves being hunted by the species they usually kill. Okay, where am I going with all this? It's been fun, but have we gotten anywhere? I think there are a few conclusions I can offer you about the ancient Moche and about us. About the ancient Moche, I think we have to really think about them in a more complicated way than we have in the past. And in terms of hunting, clearly they are not modern Euro-American sports hunters. But they are not primitives who have to hunt to eat, right? We saw that deer hunting was a tiny part of their diet, and deer is really a kind of ritual activity that is not something that's part of regular economic life. So we need some kind of third model. So the question is, where are we going to get it? And I think one thing we can do is just to look more closely at representations of deer hunting. So here's a rollout of one pot, and if you look, there's a lot of different figures involved in this. I don't know if I dare to use this arrow, but down here at the bottom, you've got these assistants that are holding out a net. And they're very humble, like they're very tiny, they don't have really fancy clothes on. And then the sort of purple all the way on the far left, right, you're right. That's a higher status kind of assistant. He's a little bit bigger. He's got a somewhat fancier outfit. He does hold a weapon. It's a kind of a club. He's sort of like a beater. He's like hitting the deer so it jumps towards the hunter. And then you've got the dog in there. And then you've got this elaborately dressed lord. He's wearing his finest outfit. He's got his jewelry. He's got his earrings and his nose thing and his necklace and his headdress. And you can see that he's the only one who's holding the weapons that actually make the kill. So it's exclusive to him to be allowed to actually be the killer, right? So you've got this whole elaborate social hierarchy. So rather than some excursion into finding your natural self, that'll be part of it, but part of what's going on here is really reinscribing social status and hierarchy among species and among people within the human species. And what is that the most like? That's the most like medieval and Renaissance and later European hunts, right? Where you've got the right to wear like the red coat, the right to ride the horse versus being on the ground, and this whole elaborate hierarchy again of species and of classes that are part of this kind of hunt. So I think that to think about Moche, we're going to need a model that looks at a couple of different things. It needs to borrow some examples from elsewhere, like the European hunt, and also, though, to pay attention to the Indigenous American traditions, not to go sort of too far in either direction. Because I think that to understand the whole imagery of the Moche deer hunt, we're going to have people talk about violence, certainly, which people writing about Moche always talk about violence, but also to talk about the sacred, and to talk about domination, which is very much part of Moche iconography, and which does show up in images of the deer hunt, but also about that reciprocity imagery that's so powerful in Native American imagery, not only in small tribes, but also among the Aztecs, among the Moche. So we need to be able to talk about all of those things together. And finally, I'd just like to offer maybe a few conclusions about us. So anthropologists say that how we hunt says something about who we are, right? It's not just a universal natural thing. So who are we then these days when we hunt a deer? What could we say about that? Well, it's really kind of amazing once you start looking at deer imagery, how many kinds of conflicting images of deer we kind of have running around in our heads. Like I said before, we like to imagine deer simultaneously as wild, but also as kind of tame or sort of tameable, sort of gentle. And then, of course, we love to see them as our innocent victim. Bambi's mother is probably the most famous example. But then we also represent them as kind of our worthy opponent, right? You know, and this is even more true. I don't have any examples, but if you look at older, like 19th century images of deer hunting, the deer really appears as a fearsome opponent that almost brought the hunter down, but was finally killed. And this kind of imagery becomes very gendered and sexualized, so that deer hunting has a lot going on about masculinity. The rack of antlers, you know, symbolizes the deer's masculinity, you know, and the bigger the rack, you know, the more masculine the hunter who brings him down. So the deer that we kill, we kind of get to take its power onto ourselves. But on the other hand, there's also this kind of weird sexual imagery of conquest. And I have to say that some of the first kill narratives I read made me a little bit uncomfortable in that way, because you sort of have a father taking his child out for this, what feels an awful lot like losing your virginity. I don't know, it's very sexualized. And one of the examples that really, or one of the images that really, I think, captures that is this famous painting by Frida Kahlo, Venadito, where she depicts herself as a deer. So here you see the deer as the kind of feminized victim, and if you know the meaning behind this, each one of those arrows is supposed to be one of the many infidelities of her husband that's wounding her. So you have all kinds of sexual stuff going on, and of course in Spanish, to cuckold is to put horns on someone, so he's put horns on her head. Of course, it's typical of Frida Kahlo, and also I think of the ambiguous sexuality we attribute to deer, that although there's something very feminine about this, the deer itself is masculine. It's got antlers, and it's called the venadito. So it's sort of kind of simultaneously both female and male. And so we've got sort of all of those things, it seems like, kind of going on with this deer in our minds. And I think, if we think about that, and we sort of think about what we see when we look at deer, we could say that deer and humans have been locked in a close relationship for a very long time. We like to see the deer, we see the deer, I think, as both like ourselves, so it's kind of a mirror for us, as is often said about animals. I mean, it's a fellow mammal, and the imagery of deer is very much about life and death. We think about that when we look at deer. We think about that, you know, balance and inevitability of living and dying. And we see it as both ordinary and magical. And those are things that I think we can sort of see it as a mirror in those ways. But we also always see it as unlike ourselves. It's our fascinating, elusive, and desirable kind of other. But I think whatever we see in a deer, that vision does help us define ourselves. That might be our animal selves, it might be our mystical selves, or what social anthropologists would more likely say. It might simply be that helps us see ourselves as members of our own society as it stands at a particular moment in history. Thank you.